The other key point I touched on earlier was that more than one person can be responsible for an accident at the same time. And a good example of that is the Go Creek decision. Again, Go Creek was a company that was involved in construction work. On one occasion, they were undertaking work that involved the lifting of concrete panels. Now, these concrete panels were wet because there'd been some rain, and they were lifting them near overhead power lines. The panels came into contact with the overhead power lines and electricity shorted down through the panel and through the crane. There were also two riggers who were holding tag lines to guide the concrete panels. Both of them received electric shocks. One of them was badly injured and the other worker died. The company was prosecuted fundamentally because they had no safe systems of work in place. They hadn't isolated the power lines, they didn't have permission for the work, there was no risk assessment done for the work, a whole range of failings which meant that they had not done everything reasonably practicable to ensure that their employees weren't exposed to hazards while at work. Now, we're not going to explore the concept of reasonably practicable in this presentation, but we will be looking at it in a later presentation. The company manager was prosecuted because the court found that the company's failure to have safe systems of work in place was due to the company manager's neglect. Again, the concept of neglect is something that applies specifically to obligations for managers, and we'll be looking at that as a concept when we come to look at the manager's presentation later on. Finally, the crane driver was also prosecuted. As an employee, he had an obligation to take reasonable care to avoid adversely affecting the safety and health of another person. The court said, in the context of the work that he was doing, this meant that the crane driver should have kept a proper lookout while he was operating near overhead power lines. Ultimately, the evidence was that the crane driver wasn't keeping a proper lookout, and so he was also convicted. What you can see from this case is that more than one party can be prosecuted over an accident. But it's also important to note that each of those parties could not point to the failures of the other party as a defence. So, for example, the crane driver couldn't say, well, I might not have kept a proper lookout, I might not have met my obligations, but as a defence, my employer didn't have any safe systems of work. That's not a defence, because what happens is the court says, we understand that other parties might have failed, but what we're doing now is we're looking at your obligations. You have a legal obligation to ensure that you take reasonable care to avoid adversely affecting the safety and health of another person. Did you meet that obligation? At the same time, the company director and the company couldn't say, well, yes, there was an accident and yes, we had no safe systems of work, but that's not our fault because we had an employee who didn't do the right thing. We had a crane driver who failed to keep a proper lookout. That's not how health and safety legislation works. Health and safety legislation creates individual obligations for a whole range of duty holders. It creates obligations for employees, for companies, for supervisors and for managers. In the event of a prosecution or an inquiry, the question that gets asked is, what did you do? You have specific obligations under health and safety legislation, and what I want to know, as a lawyer advising you, as a court looking at the case, is whether or not you met those obligations. You need to bear in mind that in health and safety legislation, you only have two choices, guilty or not guilty. It's a quasi-criminal prosecution and it results in a conviction. It's not like a case where people sue each other for money, where people could say, well, I was 10% responsible and this other person was 25% responsible and we can split the difference. Health and safety legislation creates individual obligations that you either meet or you don't meet. If you meet your obligations, then you're not guilty of an offence. If you don't meet your obligations, you're guilty.